Good afternoon, Trojan family. I'm Erica Maldonado Singh, Associate Director of USC Dornsife Alumni Relations. Thank you for joining us for today's Dornsife Dialogue. If you're watching on Zoom, you're welcome to submit a question at any time using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. If you have to leave today's discussion at any point, or you want to watch or listen to it again, you have two options. It'll be available on our Dornsife Dialogues podcast, available on all your favorite podcast platforms, and a link to the video will be on the Dornsife Dialogues page of our website. If you're not already following USC Dornsife on Instagram, X, Facebook, or YouTube, please do. We share research from our scholars and much more. Our handle on all of those platforms is at USC Dornsife. Now I'll turn it over to the Dean of the USC Dornsife College of Letters, Arts, and Sciences, Amber Miller.
Welcome back to Dornsife Dialogues. It has been less than a year since ChatGPT was released to the general public. While this is by no means the only example of increasingly advanced artificial intelligence capabilities, it has been the most visible one to many people, and it has already profoundly changed the conversation across a number of industries. When it comes to AI, minds often turn first to questions about the future of work. We are seeing how some industries are beginning to use it to augment human productivity, while others are preparing to replace aspects of the traditional workforce. And while the future of work in an advanced AI landscape is an important topic, these are not the only important questions. We also need to recognize and begin to anticipate the ways in which AI might transform our political and social spheres, how it will reshape power dynamics, privacy norms, and the ways we define intellectual property. And we will need to be thinking very hard about how AI developed for one sector might influence others. For example, what are the cybersecurity and national security risks of releasing capable AI tools into a sphere where they may be used in unintended ways? As always, we have a terrific panel of experts with us here today to help us unpack these questions and offer some perspective on what's around the corner. Our discussion will be moderated by Professor of Sociology and Anthropology, Andrew Lakoff, who serves as Director of the USC Dornsife Center on Science, Technology, and Public Life. Professor Lakoff's research explores globalization processes, the history of human sciences, contemporary social theory, and risk society. He has published dozens of journal and chapter articles, and he has authored or co-authored 5 books, with another one on the way. So let's get to it. I'll hand things over to Professor Lakoff, who will introduce our panelists. And thank you, as always, for tuning in.
Thanks to Dean Miller for that introduction. So I serve as Director of the Center on Science, Technology, and Public Life, which serves as a platform for research, training, and public engagement on pressing questions at the intersection of science, technology, and society. And I'm pleased to welcome you today to our panel on automation, AI, and our human future. Century, my mind turns to examples like the splitting of the atom, human spaceflight, in vitro fertilization, or genetic engineering. The current discussion about generative AI feels like one of those moments. There's a sense of wonder about new capacities that is accompanied by deep unease about the implications of these capacities. It's a conversation about software engineering, but it's simultaneously a conversation about what makes us human and whether our efforts to achieve technical mastery may have unanticipated and unwelcome consequences. And it seems to have implications for fields ranging from entertainment to the arts, to education, to journalism, all the way to the future of warfare. Our guests today for the panel are perfect interlocutors for helping us to reflect on these questions. Ziad Borat is a South African political theorist whose work focuses on automation and AI, global digital governance, and democratic politics. He's the Associate Director of the new USC Center on Generative AI and Society, as well as a fellow at the Mozilla Foundation's Responsible Computing Challenge Program. He holds an MBA from Oxford and a PhD in political science from UCLA, and he was previously a USC Berggruen Fellow at the Center on Science, Technology, and Public Life. Jennifer Peterson is an Associate Professor of Communication at USC. Her most recent book, How machines came to speak, media technologies, and freedom of speech shows how changes in media technologies from silent film to computer code have transformed the legal boundaries of the speech or expression covered under the First Amendment. Her current research focuses on the history of conceptions of agency and intelligence in artificial intelligence and the implications of AI for legal constructions of personhood. I'll kick off the panel with a few questions for Ziad and Jennifer, and then we'll have a good amount of time to address queries from audience members, which you can submit using the Q&A function. So let me start with a couple of very basic questions. What makes a generative AI tool such as ChatGPT distinct from prior iterations of artificial intelligence? And why has its release into the world over the last 10 months or so created such a stir? Ziad, why don't you start?
Sure. Thank you so much, Andy, for that introduction. And it's great to be here and to have folks plugged in from all over on this seminar. It's a good question. I think I wanna start off by saying the pandemic really changed the way we follow global conversations. I feel like we are attuned, in a sense, to developments on a global scale, unlike we've ever been before. And so it's only natural for me that AI and new developments in AI, like generative AI, like ChatGPT, have come to the fore in this most prominent way. Folk have been working on this for a long time, but I think there are two things that stand out in addition to that. One is the scale of deployment. Suddenly you could find these tools everywhere. They have these radical transformative capabilities. And then secondly, they were able to tap into a basic user case that you could tap into at home, right? And this is the difference between it and something like, let's say, CRISPR technologies or genetic engineering that form the basis of the mRNA vaccine for COVID, for example. You know, we knew it was a big thing. We knew it was a big deal, and indeed it was, and folk have been chatting about it for some time. But generative AI and ChatGPT, OpenAI, all of these conversations actually stem from the fact that I can log in to OpenAI's system and start playing around with ChatGPT and do incredibly amazing things that I wasn't able to do previously in the comfort of my own home. So I think it's that usability, that the global usability and the ability to follow that conversation that really has sparked this this increased interest from all stakeholders, aside from obviously the fact that it's a very radical and novel technology with a new use case for us. And I want to actually, to speak to your first question, you know, what are the nuts and bolts a little bit about generative AI? I actually want to hear a little bit from Jen to see what you might have to add on that actually.
Sorry. In answer to Andy's question or prompt about why generative AI is so is provoking so much conversation, I think there's a couple of things that are key to this. And the first of these has to do with machine learning, and generative AI is a subcategory or a particular application of machine learning. And some of it has to do with the type of activities that generative AI does, you know, expression, conversation, creation. But first, to think about machine learning. So machine learning is a little bit different from software or computer programming, the way we have used computers in the past to do things, in that it's not programmed in the same way. Machine learning is a process not by which a programmer sits down and creates a set of instructions that tell the computer exactly what to do. In machine learning, the process is less defined in advance by the outcome is defined in advance by a programmer, but the process itself isn't. It is a case where a lot of what happens at the computational level. So if we think about something like, if you want the computer to recognize what an image of a cat is, this is kind of a famous example, is like recognizing cats, because the internet is made up of cats and we need to be able to know what is a cat and what isn't a cat. You could try to create a program that gives a really explicit set of instructions on how to recognize a cat. And we tried to do that for a long time and it didn't work very well. Machine learning is a really different type of process by which programmers do define the outcome, you know, recognize a cat, select and provide the data, and maybe even give certain parameters on types of selection or decision-making processes. But then the computers start trying to find correlations between images that they know are cats, the training sets identify as cats, and new images. And so, there's a training that, again, people say, yes, you got it right, this is a cat, or no, you got it wrong. And so this is this type of machine learning, its creation of a model, is something where we don't really have an author or a creator, right? It's hard to say who did this. Is it the work of the computer programmers? Is it the work of the computers themselves? Does it have to do with the selection of the data set? So you have this kind of, I think, anxieties over control, just what is going on. And a lot of times when we talk about transparency or black boxes, this is the set of concerns. We don't really know quite what the rationale or the reasons are for how the computer recognizes the cat in the end. And to some extent, generative AI works in a similar way. And I think in addition to those concerns about process and who is the origin or who's in control, when we have stuff like generative AI, it also has to do with the outputs, right? We're looking at examples of conversations, of art, of use of language. These are all types of things that we tend to think of as being uniquely human, as markers of particular type of human intelligence, if not pinnacles of human intelligence. So I think that generative AI has raised some really big questions about how do we think about agency? What is creativity, right? If we tend to think of creativity as coming from a unique person and their experiences, and we find out that large language models, which really at basis, what they're doing is predicting the next word in a sentence. So, right, these are trained on lots and lots of sentences, and what the model is doing in any case is responding to a prompt, providing the most likely genre and next word in a sentence. And really, it comes down to that. And if a really sophisticated use of statistics and also training procedures and data can produce what we think of as art, is what's going on in art, not what we thought it was. And I just want to say one more thing on this, and then I'll wrap up. In that these are things that we tend to really closely associate with being human, human expression, et cetera. They do raise these larger questions that Andy was alluding to in the opening around the boundaries of the human. And this isn't only, what do we think of and what are we talking about when we talk about humans? And this is not only for philosophers, but this has to do with things like human rights. So that has really big implications for institutions and law.
So you both touched on a couple of points that I think help us in understanding why there's so much discussion and attention to generative AI. And as we've seen this flurry of commentary over the last 10 months in response to the release of tools like ChatGPT, it seems like there are two camps among the expert commentators in how we should think about the ethical and political implications of these tools. On the one side are what we might call the sirens. They're warning us of various kinds of impending doom, all the way from the increased spread of disinformation to a loss of control over our own fate in a dystopian world that's run by intelligent machines. On the other side are what we might call the sanguine camp, and they point to previous innovations in communication technology, from the invention of writing to the personal computer, that were initially greeted with great anxiety, but that in the end led to an expansion of human creativity. I'm curious to hear where each of you stand along this spectrum from sirens to sanguine. Ziad, why don't you start?
Sure. Andy, I love the way that you phrased, we came up with that terminology of sanguine versus sirens. I think for me, it closely maps different approaches that we find in the literature, which is there's a techno-optimistic camp and the techno-pessimistic camp, and there's various shades in between, realists, etc. And so these are determined ways of thinking about what technology will do for us, and they have their own traditions and their own literature and their own political movements, so to speak. I'll be honest with you, I am often seen hanging out with sirens but that's only because I borrow quite heavily from the phrase popularized by, but not originally coined by, Gramsci in the Prison Notebooks, that there's pessimism of the intellect and optimism of the will. I think that we really ought to be thinking and very deeply about technologies that we deploy, why we build them and why we deploy them and how we deploy them, and being critical about all of these facets and dimensions that go into these questions around technology. But at the same time, be optimistic about what we can do together, right? And optimistically build. So it's not necessarily a kind of, oh, I'm sitting in the middle. It's a general disposition to how I think about technology, which is be critical. It's important to be critical. It's important to ask questions, right? But it's also important to take those questions into something that's constructive and to build something, because it is the case. It absolutely is the case that we are, wealthier than we ever used to be in human history on the average. Our health outcomes are much more improved than compared with, say, for example, hundreds of years prior. I mean, there are absolute benefits on those outcome levels that we can point to and allude to, even amongst some of the things we might say are a little bit more critical. So that's my general approach, but curious to hear from either of you, actually, where you find yourselves.
Yeah, Jennifer, siren or sanguine?
So as a historian, I tend a bit toward the sanguine, though I have my moments of alarm or where the sirens are going off. Like Ziad was talking about, we have a very long history of talking about these things and having strong reactions to new technologies. And it's easy to forget just how revolutionary a lot of those were. Thinking about media, right? Photography, it's really hard to imagine just how disruptive photography was, and the type of really large questions about time, temporality, art, creativity, to name only a few things that and evidence that photography brought. Likewise, radio. It's such a background taken for granted, very boring technology today. It was, voices from the ether, like hauntings or something when it first arose. And it was something where one person could speak to, one potentially autocratic political leader could use the radio to address people in different countries. This was deeply terrifying for many reasons. People thought it was going to homogenize culture and people's minds. So we've seen a lot of new technologies that seemed incredibly disruptive at the beginning. And then over time, they become institutionalized. We develop regulations, but also sets of uses. Industry develops best practices. Users develop different ways of interacting with these technologies. So we see a lot of innovation on the part of the users and social change that and adaptation. If we're thinking about and it often shifts social relations, right? We see these things not kind of replacing or collapsing or threatening things like we might think about creativity, but rather transferring these, changing how we do things. I think back to learning to write papers. Like I'm old enough to have started writing my papers longhand and then transferring them to the computer, and then going from that to composing with the computer. And that did change the way that I wrote. It changed my process of thinking and creation, but I don't know that it didn't destroy it, right? It just merely transformed and kind of shifted it. And I think my sirenic moments have to do with the things that are maybe unique to or that are different about AI. We talked a little bit about what's special about generative AI. What these models are really, really good at is mimicking human communication. What they absolutely cannot do is think about what those words mean. They don't have good models for articulating words to the things that they refer to in the world. So they're really terrible at giving you facts, of knowing whether they're giving you, and knowing is an anthropomorphization, right? They're very bad at providing sorting out disinformation from information, and thinking about causal relationships. And I think this is a source for at least mild alarm, and thinking through how we are going to implement these technologies. I mean, we're already having these conversations in our classrooms, I know, around how ChatGPT will be implemented. Yeah.
So let's turn to some specific topic areas, and sit a little bit with these pessimists of the intellect and what they're warning us about. And among my colleagues, there are those who are worried that professors may become obsolete. And certainly, we're already seeing lots of student essays being turned in that may have been produced by ChatGPT, and that may actually be better than many of the student essays that were produced beforehand. So I want to turn more specifically to the question of what these recent developments in AI might mean for the future of work. And the stakes are obviously very high here, as we can see in the current strikes in Hollywood. Do you think anxiety about automation and the replacement of human labor is a real risk this time? Ziad, why don't you start?
Yeah, and I think the key phrase there is, and you used actually two, worry and anxiety. So I think a lot of work has been done, especially by economists, to try and map out what is automation, what is AI and automation going to do to jobs? Are we going to lose jobs? Are we going to create new jobs? I think some of the more nuanced stories I've seen focus on actually who loses out, right? What is the granularity involved in who loses out? What are the conditions of work, i.e., how much will people be working, those who retain their jobs, what kind of jobs will they be employed in, how long will those jobs take them to do each day? Those are the kinds of nuances that I think will be most impacted, in fact, actually, with the advent of these new technologies. And people are right to be concerned about this, right? This anxiety is not a new one. I want to say when we look at automation and its history, and I mean way, way back, my research on automation took me to Greek antiquity, where we were talking about the classical Greek philosophers were talking about the replacement of slaves by tools that could perform their own tasks. There's this real anxiety that is a part of human history about the replacement of labor, but also the conditions of work that folk will face in the advent of tools that might be able to supplant or somehow even augment their work. We don't even have to go back as far as ancient Greece to look at this. I mean, in the 1950s, in the 1940s, 1950s, automation was such a huge topic. There was a front page of the New York Times which spoke to what we've just been talking about, this idea that automation can either free us to do more and better things, or it's going to be a harbinger of doom and we're all going to lose our jobs. That was the front page of the New York Times way back when. And there were congressional inquiries about automation, what it would do to labor. So some of these debates that we're having, actually, this anxiety, it's not new. It's real, and actually, it's to maybe the word of the day. It's generative. Actually, it's an important generative aspect of our human endeavor, our thinking towards these technologies, to be able for us to take a step back and say, okay, how are we going to organize now? How are we going to? How do we imagine our life proceeding from here on, given the advent of such a groundbreaking and novel technology, which, however, taps into an age-old anxiety about our relationship to the tools that we employ and the labor which we undertake. So I think the anxiety is real. Anxiety also has political effects. There's a study out that was done by the Oxford Martin School at the University of Oxford, which shows how actual electoral outcomes are impacted by people's attitudes towards automation, showing that in areas where there was a higher chance of routine labor being automated, folk tended to vote in certain ways that were statistically significant when compared with others. So I think there's also a translation effect here into political outcomes, and we might increasingly see some of that as well.
I'm going to turn our conversation in just a moment to questions around the relation between AI and politics. But I first want to give Jennifer a chance to address this question of your sense of what AI might mean for the future of work.
Yeah, and I've been thinking about this a little bit in relationship to media industries and intellectual property. And in that area right now, immediately, there isn't a lot of There's not an immediate danger for a very simple reason, that works produced by generative AI are not copyrightable. And media industries really want to copyright content. So jobs are not necessarily yet being in immediate danger of being replaced in that way, though I think in the future there very much will be. But one of the interesting things here is, well, first off, the way that the Copyright Office has really doubled down on things can only be copyrighted if they're produced by humans. They've said, AI generated works are not right now accepted. I think they will be. They're in the middle of a large study, but they kind of doubled down and said, well, we're not going to take AI. We're also not going to take photographs from or art produced by animals or works produced by deities. So they produced a number of interesting rules around this. And one case that is really interesting that shows how this is being used was, there was a graphic artist who produced a comic book, and the title is Zarya of the Dawn. And she used a text-to-image generator, Midjourney, to help produce the images in this. And she tried to copyright it. And at first she did copyright it. And then the Copyright Office revoked the copyright on this because they kind of came to understand more how AI was used in the production of this work. And afterwards they said, okay, well, we'll copyright the text and the relationship of the text to the image, but we're not going to copyright the images. And so this is a little bit of a break on industries, and they're having to think through, which is kind of good, I think, because it's giving us time to think about how to bring in these technologies to the production of culture, and if you want to call it content. I think that it is changing the way people work. Like for this artist, she worked with a AI model. I don't know why she chose that. It might be something that augmented her artwork. It might have been instead of working with an artist. There may have been an artist displaced there, to Ziad's point. But it's certainly shifting the crux of what people are doing, how people are engaging in creativity. And one thing that we are seeing in some of these media industries is people hiring folks who are creative with prompts and prompt engineering. So as we begin to incorporate these models, the type of work that people are doing are changing. You're maybe not producing content for a website or something like that, but you are working with, in conjunction, creating prompts and responding, selecting generative ChatGPT responses and amending them. Now, to Ziad's point about how that changes the nature of work, I don't know. I don't know if it's better to be writing content for the website or working with this tool. And I imagine that does vary. And that's a site for very interesting kind of conversations, concern, but also action.
Yeah, this area of intellectual property is also a nice site where we have to pose questions about what human originality and authorship really mean. I mean, and of course, in other areas before generative AI, those questions have come up. You might think about sampling in music, or ways in which authors have been accused of plagiarizing because they of course borrow themes from prior great works. So again, on the one hand, nothing new, but on the other hand, lots of pretty distinct specific instantiations and possibly different implications this time. I want to remind members of the audience that you can submit questions to our panelists via the Q&A function, and we'll be turning to those questions in just a few minutes. I want now to turn to the question of what AI might mean for our politics. Does AI open up new forms of freedom, or does it risk entrenching authoritarianism? And how might AI and automation change international relations? Ziad, do you want to take a crack at one or both of those questions?
Huge topics. Well, I'll start off by noting that if you look at some of the major indices that track democracy over time, we are really in an era of democratic backsliding. The democracy index that's done by The Economist since its inception, even a controlling for the pandemic, we're seeing democracy decline. And yet, interestingly enough, at the same time, this might be a spurious correlation, but I haven't really seen enough research done to connect the two or not connect the two. But at the same time, and at the same token, we're in an explosive era of automation. We increase the amount of robots that we use in manufacturing factories each year on year. It keeps increasing to new records. We are increasing our investments in automation and AI, and there's a wonder if these two are related. So that, I think that's an open question, and a question that we really need to delve into, because yes, I think there is a scope, especially for the use of technology to curtail, suppress, surveil peoples and populations to an extent that's unprecedented, right? These technologies can be absolutely misused by governments, but not only by governments, by private actors, large private actors that have the resources, and in some cases the revenues in excess of other large countries themselves, who are able to exert influence over whole population groups. And so that runs the risk of de facto authoritarianism for sure, right? We need democratic modes of accountability. We don't find that in corporate environments, and in many of these environments where AI is being developed and deployed, and yet it has global impact. And so I think that's a key concern of mine, is that AI can really be used to accelerate the suppression of peoples. That's something we have to guard against. In terms of how it changes international relations, well, we have to look as well in terms of global supply chains. The AI that you interact with in terms of ChatGPT has an entire supply chain attached to it, a complex infrastructure, right? And that goes all the way down into the minerals, the rare earth minerals that are being used to create the servers that are being relied upon for these technologies to be able to function, right? But also the laborers that work in other countries outside of, let's say, the global north, who label data and who clean data and who are part of the AI ecosystem and supply chain. And so you start to see AI takers, right, who are adopting AI models from spaces and places that can afford to develop extremely expensive and complicated and complex AI tools, and regions that are therefore must take these models, or do take these models, and folk who are, let's say, downstream in the supply chain, who are creating these models but not adequately compensated, or under conditions of labor and work in a global supply chain that changes their relationship to power in ways that have traditionally not been the case, right? So we see global movements because of AI. We can see global movements in which states rise to the fore and which states start to shrink back based on their capacity and capability to deal with these new global supply chains, and how their people, their workers, their industries can adapt or not. And I think that's one key way in which it is already starting to shift those conversations and those power imbalances, and having, in many cases, deleterious effect on historically oppressed peoples in places such as the global South.
Ziad, your mention of the material infrastructures, the extractive resources, the invisible labor that underpins these computing technologies also leads me to want to mention a great book by one of our colleagues here at USC, Kate Crawford, called An Atlas of AI. So for those of you who are interested in this topic, it's very much worth exploring that book and others that she's been involved in. Jennifer, let me give you a chance to say a word or two about the political implications of AI from your perspective.
I think everything that Ziad brought up about those unseen material infrastructures and conditions of possibility for AI are super important in understanding the way that the need for these minerals, supply chains, creates conditions of possibility or bolsters autocratic regimes, repressive policies, and repression of people is super important. I would add that I think that one of the things that, one of the kind of political dangers around AI is the ability to use these tools to generate the kind of scale of content that they can create that creates illusions of support for political leaders is a really alarming, to go back to the Sirenic moment. That's another Sirenic moment. It's a really alarming potentiality. It allows, that can enable political leaders to act as if they have a, kind of a support for a set of policies they don't. It also affects, we know from research that this affects the way that people vote and stuff. If they think a leader has support, they're more likely to support that leader. So these are potentially dangerous political tools.
I'm going to turn in just a moment to some questions that we're already getting from audience members, but I want to first follow up this thread about the sort of dangerous political implications of the new technologies, and ask you both, given these potential dangers and the broad potential ramifications of these technological innovations, it's not surprising that there are currently increasing calls for the government to impose regulations on the development and use of generative AI. Are there unique challenges to regulating AI? And where should policymakers be most focused in targeting their efforts? Jen, let's start with you for a change.
So one of the first things that I think is probably an issue in regulating AI is the number of different things that get labeled as AI. So I think that we need to be more specific and targeted in these conversations. Like if you think about everything, from Netflix recommendations to ChatGPT, this is not, and there's a lot of other applications. This is only in thinking about media and communication that it's really hard to have a general framework. So being a little more targeted. I think that when we're talking about regulation, we should not only think about the government. There's a lot of levels of regulation. There is, legislature, government agencies are engaged in regulation, but also it's important to remember that the industry is engaged in regulation as well, through, self-regulating bodies, through trust and safety divisions at companies, to the very design of products. And we need to think about all of these as forms of regulation. And I do think that there are some challenges here, and I don't know that they're unique to AI. I think that these are all being developed in Silicon Valley culture, where the motto has been a very quite a celebratory move fast and break things, is a bit of a problem. There's a lot of things we might not want to be broken. And I think that this is one of the reasons, at least the reason that people like OpenAI's Sam Altman are giving for trying to get government involvement, is a sense that these companies are caught up in needing to produce something new, make money, get out there faster than the next guy, and trying to just, the kind of capitalist pressures and industry culture pressures on them to make the next new thing without thinking about how it might be deployed are problematic. And I think this is at least one reason. There may be others that some industry leaders are calling for some kind of regulation to kind of put common constraints on everybody, so that you don't feel pressure to produce some tool that you think might have dangerous political outcomes or bad outcomes for workers, et cetera.
Ziad, what are your thoughts on where regulatory and legal efforts should be most focused right now?
Yeah, I think, it's such a huge task, and I think we are at a unique moment where global attention is focused on it at every level, that we are capable of achieving some form of meaningful regulation here. But I would say that it is a real win if we're just basically able globally to agree on certain norms around the deployment and use of AI, specifically as it relates to, let's say, nuclear warfare decision making on anything to do with nuclear, anything to do with lethal autonomous weapons, anything to do with military applications that can absolutely go haywire when we have humans out of the loop to an extent that is quite dangerous, in fact. So I think norms around that might be easier for us to corral around globally, and I think that's definitely where we can see some meaningful movement. I will say that, you know, talking about AI in the way that we have been talking about it recently reminds me a lot of the way we talked about, say, 10, 15 years ago, about the advent of just digital, right? Digital itself became this thing with this word in which, you know, we had to regulate digital, we had to understand digital. Digital was everywhere. And so that's the case where, yeah, it's going to be everywhere and in many multiple sectors, multiple areas of focus. So, you know, let's focus on the security, you know, the ones that can cause massive damage. At least let's be able to focus on that. But I would also say, you know, education, we say, you know, we want skills development, we want to narrow the skills gap. Everybody recognizes that. But how often have we seen, you know, actual educational policies on a local government level that have to do with AI, or empowering our public libraries, for example, to offer training courses in AI that we are easily able to access? So where is the education policy in AI, and how is it reaching students and folk from the, you know, the youngest cohorts? So education, you know, high-end nuclear lethal autonomous weapons. And then as Jen was talking about, you know, property is a huge deal. So intellectual property and figuring out what that means. I've often joked with folk that, in, you know, especially in the US, IP law is probably more important than constitutional law, which is, you know, a half joke, but it gets to a point of something that is actually, it's something we have to figure out when it comes to AI, because it is actually foundational in the use and deployment of these systems, and also the global patterns of inequality that can result. So figuring out globally what we do in the space of copyright law is going to be, it's a challenge, it's ongoing, and we're starting to see these cases being taken up and in multiple jurisdictions, and where we end up and how we can agree on them. I think those are the areas that, and then there are multiple areas, but those are the three that come top of mind to me.
You know, your mention of questions around educational opportunity and inequality is a nice segue to one of the questions that we've gotten from our audience members. So Susan asks, following up from the opening siren versus sanguine question, can our speakers address how they imagine AI will impact, first of all, people of different socioeconomic backgrounds, and secondly, the quality of our ability to weave diverse, resilient communities? And she notes in closing, there is paid work, but there's also unpaid work of care that would certainly be impacted by some of the implications of AI. So who would like to jump into Susan's question?
I'll take a stab at it and then pass it off to Ziad. I think that first off, we have every reason to believe that AI will benefit the wealthy and you know, not benefit the you know, the poor. But there are a few things that complicate that, in that some of the tasks that AI is best at replacing are more professionalized work, white collar work, higher paid work. We were looking at radiologists. We're talking about, you know, our college professors going to be replaced. Lawyers are worried about their jobs. So there is a little bit of a complication in this. And I think in terms about resilient and diverse communities, there's a very real concern, especially when we think about the way these models work. They're predicting the most likely, if we think about ChatGPT, predicting the most likely next word in the sentence. So this is based on, you know, what is, you know, a probabilistic model of the looking at how everyone else has used these words in lots of different examples. So there is a kind of both a homogenizing force going on there in what is created, but also a weighting of things toward what the data is there, what examples we fed it. So there is both a kind of homogenizing, so that's the opposite of diverse communities, but also potentially, you know, kind of shifting these things toward shifting what is produced to reflect existing power structures, existing, if you think about who are the authors that we have more access to, we have more examples of white authors, male authors, just a much larger corpus of texts, and you could go on to add to that. So I don't think that these have a lot of promise in those areas, and indeed there are concerns in those areas.
Yeah, I want to echo a lot of what Jen was saying as well, in terms of, the sheer potential for inequality to be further entrenched with the advent of these, especially if we continue along the line of how we currently are in terms of who owns these AI systems, some of which are incredibly expensive to develop, maintain, deploy, and therefore are out of reach, even if we might talk about democratizing AI solutions, right? Unless there is some mechanism by which we can own these systems in a meaningful manner, which is often not the case, we are always going to be at the behest of those who can control these systems and manipulate them to certain effects, right? And so the potential for inequality is quite great here, without seeming too much like a siren. But I think there's a double-edged sword here. On one hand, our ability to weave resilient communities together, I think that it's a double-edged sword, because on one hand, I see local community fragmentation wherever I go. I mean, when was the last time folk were really plugged into their local communities and consider themselves as part of their neighborhoods to an extent that they were participating in, local council meetings? And people do that, right, to different degrees in various places. But one of the effects of these technologies has been to fragment that. On the other hand, it's allowed, for example, for us to be sitting here virtually across multiple jurisdictions and to create new cleavages and create new forms of community. So on what I would like to see, let's say the optimism of the will here is to augment, let's say, we use AI technologies to augment our ability to form local communities of practice and local community participation. And as much as the same time, it can facilitate global conversations, which it is clearly already doing. On the point of care, I mean, care really speaks to a number of issues, one of which I'll deal with. If you look at a lot of the research, and this is not just research on AI now, and it's not just research on automation now, it's research that was looking at automation from way back when, in the last 100 years or so. Traditionally, care and work that was attributed to women are the areas in which folk would lose out the most, and that is exactly where predictions are lying. And what we're seeing now as well is that work of care in many cases is devalued. Work of care and work attributed to women in particular, who have traditionally performed work of care, has been devalued. It's an interesting question, because care becomes so much more important when AI systems can't necessarily do so. And even though there are attempts to replicate this through all sorts of robots and whatnot, to replicate and to try and develop models of care, it still seems to be the case that find themselves when it comes to AI and when it comes to roles of care that are simultaneously extremely valuable in terms of what we value in society, not necessarily monetarily, but at the same time devalued from a perspective of what people are actually given in terms of monetary affordances.
And if I could just jump in and add to some of what Ziad was saying about care, one of the things that's so interesting about the history of artificial intelligence and what we imagine that it was going to do is, artificial intelligence was for a long time modeled on types of activities and reasoning that are generally coded as masculine for the longest time. And more recently, especially as it's been commercialized and commoditized and rolled out, we see a lot of what these products are doing is indeed feminized labor. secretarial work, right? First, we got rid of secretaries because we didn't think that was important. Now we're kind of realizing maybe it is important, but we're going to have, AI products that might replace that work. And if we combine this with robotics, right? Also care for the elderly, for the ill, and, in education also for the young. So we have this interesting shift toward thinking about artificial intelligence in terms that are gendered female as it becomes commercialized, and as we're looking at what jobs and labor is going to be replaced by the technology.
So a question has come in from an anonymous audience member that's very close to my heart as a faculty member at a research university. The question is, turning the lens of inquiry onto the world of academia, do you have thoughts or anticipations of the impact of AI and large language models on applications for positions, academic promotional processes and dossiers, research and lab work and authorship processes, etc.? Somebody clearly familiar with the bureaucratized of academic life. Ziad or Jennifer, thoughts on the implications for academic life?
I mean, I think all academics will agree there is a lot of paperwork and paper and a lot of writing and a lot that is a part of an academic career for sure. And what's been interesting is to see how different academics from all different types of academics, different disciplines, different positions, different areas of their career are using these tools in everyday life. And it can, in very many cases, assist with some of the very much mundane tasks that we have to perform. And when I say that, and I'll fully admit to, when I'm looking for a structure or something to say, I will sometimes, use ChatGPT for that. I won't use the language that ChatGPT gives me, but I'll look at that as a kind of reflection to be like, okay, here's a structure. And from there, if it's a task that I need to perform and to time crunch, etc. Now, that's a model in which I'm already using ChatGPT and large language models to assist my kind of thinking about drafting. And I think, when I've spoken to lawyers, something similar is happening. Something similar is happening with a lot of folk in terms of preparing and writing and just help with structure of things, right? Not necessarily putting down word for word content, although that does happen. What I would say will be very interesting, and it must be a precursor to some of these conversations, is there is an interesting area of authenticity around AI that remains to be navigated, i.e. we do somehow, and can't quite pinpoint what right this relates to in a human rights framework, but we do somehow want to know that something has been produced by a human being, or largely by a human being, right? This question of not being deceived by receiving a paper that is authentically written by a student or authentically written by the person who sent it to you is somehow important to us. So I've been tracking very closely developments in watermarking technology, and I think that'll be in its own industry. I think, the same way that AI, is creating all these opportunities, it creates new markets for itself. And one of those markets will be in authentication, right? That this was created largely or almost completely by a human being and can be checked. And we're already seeing those methods underway. And so I think there will be this balancing between recognition of that and those tools being increasingly adopted somehow, but also the benefits to administrative processing, to learning, and assisting folk who some might find it difficult with structuring things in a short amount of time, given the demands of the work which we perform, and in helping us as a tool to be able to work with structures.
Yes, I think that we will see this soon. I imagine we are going to see cover letters and whatnot that are AI assisted. If we're allowing our students to use these things to help them as tools, not to replace their work in the classroom, I would imagine we will see some of this. And I think the question about how it might change things like authoring articles is a really interesting one. In my department has already had some conversations around that, like how a lit review might be produced by or through an AI application or a plugin. and whether or not we think that that's legit. And, and this also varies with the mode of writing and different disciplines. In some disciplines, it might be easier to have sort of summaries of lit reviews that are already quite doable by ChatGPT. And others, it's a bit harder because of the way that the lit review is done discursively. But I think it's absolutely coming. It's going to be interesting in a good and bad way. I will say that the questionnaire did not include emails, and I'm really waiting for the moment when my emails can be taken over, where I can really use like one of these applications to do half of my emails. That would be good.
So we have time for crisp responses to a very big question posed by our audience member, Juan, who I think is asking us to go back to the Gramscian optimism of the will. And is, how can we tackle the hurdles to guarantee that AI technologies maintain themselves as ethical, impartial, and accountable?
Huge question.
Ziad.
Huge question. I think we need to take the first step in building consensus around what that means for us. And I think I think it requires actual effort, right? The mere fact that there are folk on this webinar, interested in or taking these steps to figure out more about AI is that step, and it needs to translate into political advocacy. What I don't see a lot of. I see a lot of top-down approaches when it comes to AI, and I see community organization that doesn't quite get the level it deserves in some of these in these conversations. So it's a question of building scale and building movements, really. I think for me, we need to have some consensus about what ethical, impartial, and accountable means, and those are not stable concepts. They're not universal concepts, and they actually require a form of participation, effort, and community building. I'm very big on, as you may have picked up, starting at the local level, which is an area very neglected in some of these conversations.
And I would say we cannot guarantee, right? This is a place where there are no guarantees. And I think, if we think about past applications or importations of technology in industry, these were not ethical, impartial, and often not accountable. So this is definitely a site of future struggle. And we will definitely see ethical, impartial, and we need to fight for accountability. And this is something that, we have in many institutions. If we think about, Ziad has talked about, factory workplaces. Also, if we think about other types of industries, these have long been critiqued and people have struggled to hold them accountable. So I think very much going to be a site of struggle. We need to do new work in the way that Ziad is talking about in order to build tools and consensus around this.
So thank you both. We've reached the end of our time. I am grateful for the audience participation and for your thoughtful reflections that remind us why authentic human beings and scholars. I think we're at the beginning of obviously a much longer set of conversations about these topics. And I'm looking forward to hearing what comes from the new USC Center on Generative AI in Society that Ziad is working with, Jennifer's current research on AI, human agency, and conceptions of human intelligence. So thanks again for joining us.
Thank you.